Imagine you're standing in the corner of a British living room. It is 1950. The air is heavy and cold, smelling faintly of soot and damp plaster. The only heat comes from a coal fire that needs constant tending. Heavy velvet drapes block out the drafts. The family is huddled together in the centre, listening to a large wooden wireless radio. It is a world of shadows, silence, and making do. Now blink. It is 1965. The room has opened up. The heavy drapes are gone, replaced by lighter, geometric curtains. A teak sideboard stands where the old cabinet was. In the corner, a flickering black and white television set is the new hearth. The atmosphere is lighter, optimistic, modern. Blink again. It is 1979. The room has exploded into colour. The walls are patterned in bold browns and oranges. A thick shag pile carpet covers the floor. A sleek white radiator hisses under the window. The coal fire is boarded up. On the television, a programme is broadcasting in vibrant colour. In just 30 years, within these same four walls, the British way of life didn't just evolve, it mutated. We went from rationing to credit cards, from the wireless to the Walkman, and from deference to defiance. This is the story of how Britain changed decade by decade. To understand the dizzying speed of the journey we are about to take, we must first anchor ourselves in the starting line, the 1950s. It is a mistake to think that the 1950s began when the war ended. In reality, the war cast a long grey shadow that stretched well into the decade. In 1950, Britain was exhausted. It was a nation of make do and mend. Rationing did not fully end until 1954. For the first half of the decade, the British housewife was still navigating life with a coupon book. Meat, sugar, butter. These were not rights. They were allowances. The landscape itself wore the scars. In London, Liverpool and Coventry, bomb sites were not yet history. They were the adventure playgrounds for a generation of children in short trousers. The air was thick, literally. The Clean Air Act hadn't yet cleared the skies. In winter, the pea super fogs descended, a choking yellow smog that stopped buses and blackened the stonework of every building. But amidst the grey, there was a profound sense of order. This was a binary world. There was us and them. Us was the community, the street, the neighbours who you didn't just know but relied upon. Front doors were often left unlocked. Children roamed in packs, raised by the collective gaze of the neighbourhood. Them was authority, and authority was absolute. You stood for the national anthem at the cinema. You respected the teacher, the policeman, and the doctor without question. Men wore hats. Women wore hats. There was a correct way to dress, a correct way to speak, and a correct way to behave. It was a world of we, not me. Life moved at a walking pace. Most people didn't own a car. They took the bus or rode a bicycle. They didn't have a telephone. They wrote letters or used the red box on the corner. This was the baseline. A solid, slow, structured world that felt like it would last forever. But just beneath the surface of this quiet deference, the tectonic plates were beginning to grind. The pressure was building, and when the dam finally broke, the change wouldn't be a trickle. It would be a flood. To truly grasp the scale of this transformation, we have to look at the speed. For centuries, life in Britain had moved at the speed of the horse. A man living in 1850 lived a life not drastically different from his grandfather in 1800. But for the generation born in the 1940s, the timeline warped. They were born into a world of steam trains and gaslight. By the time they were 30, they were watching men walk on the moon in colour. By the time they were 40, they were computing with microchips. The change wasn't linear, it was exponential. The 1950s felt like a long, slow Sunday afternoon. But the 1960s arrived like a sports car crashing through a fence. Suddenly, the new wasn't something to be suspicious of. It was something to be consumed. New towns like Milton Keynes rose from the mud. New materials, plastic nylon formica, replaced wood and cotton. New sounds, rock and roll, drowned out the brass bands. The psychological impact of this acceleration was profound. For the older generation, it was disorienting, a feeling that the solid ground was moving beneath their feet. For the young, it was a rush of pure adrenaline. By 1980, the 1950s didn't just look like the past. To a teenager with a Walkman and a digital watch, The world of rationing books and outside toilets looked like the Victorian era. It looked like ancient history. So, how did we get from the coal bunker to the central heating thermostat? We need to look at the 4 specific revolutions that tore down the old house and built the new one. The domestic revolution. The most visceral change didn't happen in the streets. It happened in the most private rooms of the house. In the 1950s, cleanliness was hard labour. For millions of working-class families, the bathroom did not exist. There was an outside toilet, freezing in winter, visited with a candle or a torch. Bathing was a weekly logistical operation. The tin bath was dragged into the living room on a Friday night. Water was boiled in kettles and pans on the stove. The father bathed first, then the mother, then the children, all sharing the same murky, cooling water in front of the coal fire. Monday was wash day, a day of physical dread. It involved scrubbing boards, a mangle to wring out clothes by hand, and steamy kitchens filled with the smell of boiling lye soap. It took the entire day. By the 1960s, the indoor bathroom had arrived, often squeezed into a partitioned bedroom, but by the 1970s, the bathroom had become a fashion statement. Enter the Avocado bathroom suite. It is easy to mock it now, but in 1975, that green or pampas brown acrylic bath was a symbol of ultimate luxury. We carpeted our bathrooms, a hygiene nightmare by modern standards, but a reaction against the freezing linoleum of the past. And in the kitchen, the twin-tub washing machine appeared. It was noisy, it danced across the floor, and you still had to move wet clothes from the wash side to the spin side with wooden tongs. But it was a miracle. It bought women time. By 1980, the automatic washing machine was sliding under the counter. The wash day that had enslaved women for centuries was effectively abolished. The food landscape. If the bathroom changed our comfort, the kitchen changed our identity. The 1950s diet was brown, white, and boiled. It was meat and 2 veg. It was suit pudding. Olive oil was something you bought in a chemist to treat earache, not something you put on a salad. Garlic was considered foreign muck. Shopping was a daily social ritual. You went to the butcher, the baker, and the greengrocer. You chatted, you queued. The milkman delivered daily, his electric float humming in the dawn, leaving bottles with foil tops that birds would peck at. Then came the supermarket. The first self-service stores were a shock. The idea that you could pick up your own goods without asking a shopkeeper was revolutionary. It was faster, anonymous, and cheaper. By the 1960s and 70s, the British palate began to expand, often in strange directions. This was the era of the Vesta curry, a dehydrated meal in a box. You added water to the crispy noodles and the powdery sauce, and you felt cosmopolitan. It bore zero resemblance to actual Indian or Chinese food, but it was exotic. Spaghetti bolognese arrived. Initially treated with deep suspicion, it became a dinner party staple, often made with tinned tomatoes and cheddar cheese on top. And then, the freezer centre, Beecham, Iceland. Suddenly we were buying food in bulk, fish fingers, Arctic rolls, and potato waffles. We moved from fresh food forced by rationing to processed food chosen for convenience. The link between the season and the plate was broken. We could eat strawberries in December, even if they tasted of water. The British stomach had been colonised by the convenient, the frozen, and the vaguely continental. The media and leisure revolution. If the kitchen changed how we ate, the living room changed how we dreamed. In the 1950s, the wireless was the altar of the home. The family gathered around it in a semicircle, staring at the speaker grill as if it were a face. You listened to the Archers or Workers' Playtime. It was a communal act of imagination. Television existed, but it was a tiny, murky window. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 was the spark. Millions bought or rented their first set just for that day. But even then, it was a polite, limited service. The transmission ended early. The national anthem played. The screen went dark. Then came the 1960s, and the screen widened. ITV arrived with adverts. Shocking, brash, consumerist. BBC Two arrived. Suddenly we had 3 channels. We thought we were spoiled. But the real psychological shift happened in the 1970s. Colour. Go from the grey shadows of Dixon of Dock Green to the vibrant purple suits of the Morecambe and Wise show was a sensory revelation. Snooker, a game entirely dependent on colour, became a national obsession because suddenly we could tell the brown ball from the red. We became a nation of watchers. The cinema declined, the sofa ascended, and then, right at the end of our timeline in 1979, a small device arrived from Japan that shattered the communal hearth forever. The Walkman. For the first time in history, you could carry your own soundtrack. You didn't have to listen to what your parents listened to. You could shut out the world. The we of the wireless became the me of the cassette tape. Youth and authority. Perhaps the most profound change of all was the invention of a new species, the teenager. In the 1950s, you were a child, and then, abruptly, you were a small adult. You wore grey flannel shorts until you were 13, then you put on a suit that looked exactly like your father's. There was no youth culture. There was national service, until 1960, which took young men and broke them into soldiers. Discipline was the bedrock. You respected the teacher, the vicar, and the boss. Then, the 1960s detonated. It started with the music, the Beatles, the Stones, but it became about identity. Suddenly young people had money, they had fashion, they had Mary Quant and Carnation Street, they grew their hair. To a father who had fought in the war, a son with hair over his collar wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a moral failing. The generation gap opened up like a canyon. By the 1970s, the deference was dead. The hippie dream of peace had curdled into the angry energy of punk. The Sex Pistols swore on television. Strikes paralysed the country. The police were no longer the friendly local bobbies, they were the riot squad. In 30 years, the British youth had gone from saluting the flag to tearing it up. The hierarchy that had held Britain together for centuries, God, Queen and Father, was being questioned, mocked and reinvented. We had moved from a culture of duty to a culture of self-expression, and as the 70s drew to a chaotic close, these cultural rifts would set the stage for the most divisive, dynamic and individualistic decade of them all. The cultural pivot. If the 1960s was the party, the early 1970s was the hangover, and the moment the old world truly died can be pinned to a single day, decimal day. For centuries, Britain had operated on a currency system that was baffling, ancient and uniquely ours. 12 pennies to a shilling, 20 shillings to a pound. It was a mental arithmetic that defined the British mind. Then, overnight, it vanished. The arrival of the new pence was logical, modern and European, but psychologically it was a trauma. The elderly were left confused, staring at coins they didn't understand. The sixpence, a lucky charm found in Christmas puddings, was rendered worthless. It was a symbolic severance from the past. The Victorian infrastructure was being dismantled. This modernisation wasn't just in the pocket, it was on the skyline. The 1970s saw the peak of brutalist architecture. We tore down the terraced streets where communities had lived on top of each other, and we moved them into streets in the sky, concrete tower blocks. We traded the cosy, damp clutter of the past for a cold, concrete future. But the modern dream was about to crack. The crisis of the 70s. The 1970s is often remembered as the decade of beige food and disco, but the reality was far grittier. It was a decade of crisis. The optimism of the 60s crashed into the oil crisis of 1973. Suddenly the lights went out. The 3-day week, 1974, was a shock to the system. To save electricity, the government limited commercial consumption. Television stations shut down at 10:30 p.m. Shops could not use lights. Families who had just gotten used to central heating and colour TV found themselves huddled around candles again, boiling water on camping stoves. It felt like the country was sliding backward. And then came the winter of discontent, 1978 and 1979. The social contract broke. Strikes paralysed the nation. The rubbish wasn't collected. The dead weren't buried. Trains didn't run. The we of the 1950s, the community spirit that had pulled Britain through the war, had fractured into 1,000 warring factions. Unions versus government, young versus old. By 1979, the mood in Britain was exhausted. The post-war consensus had failed. The country felt ungovernable. It was grey, it was dirty, and it was angry. The pendulum had swung as far as it could go towards chaos. It was ready to swing back. And waiting in the wings was a new ideology, a new leader, and a completely new definition of what it meant to be British. The 1980s were about to arrive, and they wouldn't be polite. The arrival of the 80s. As the clock ticked over into 1980, the atmosphere in Britain shifted abruptly. The exhaust fumes of the 70s cleared, revealing a sharper, harder, and infinitely more ambitious landscape. The 1950s had been about security, the 1960s had been about freedom, the 1970s had been about survival, the 1980s would be about ownership. The psychological shift was seismic. For 30 years, millions of working-class Britons had lived as tenants of the state. They lived in council houses, painted in council colours, repaired by council workmen. Then came the right to buy. Suddenly the we of the estate became the mine of the homeowner. People bought their council houses. They replaced the wooden window frames with double glazing. They paved over the front gardens to park their new cars. The collective identity of the street began to fragment into a row of individual castles. The front door was no longer left unlocked for the neighbours. It was double locked to protect the video recorder. And with ownership came a new financial god: credit. In the 1950s and 60s, debt was a stigma. If you couldn't afford it, you saved up. You put money in a tin or a Christmas club. By 1980, the plastic revolution was underway. The Access card, the Barclay card. Take the waiting out of wanting, the slogan said, and we did. The patience that had defined the post-war character, the waiting for the kettle to boil, waiting for the bus, waiting to afford a washing machine, was evaporated by the magnetic strip. We became a nation of consumers, fueled by debt and desire. The shame of being in the red vanished, replaced by the status of the credit limit. The visual shift. The physical look of Britain changed too. For decades, the cities had been black. A century of coal smoke had coated every brick in Manchester, Leeds and London with a thick layer of grime. In the 80s we cleaned it off. The Clean Air Acts had finally done their work. The soot was sandblasted away. Britain literally became lighter, brighter and cleaner. But the high street itself was changing. The local ecosystem of the 1950s, the butcher with sawdust on the floor, the baker with the yeasty warmth, the fishmonger with the slab of ice, began to die. They were eaten by the superstore. We traded the daily chat with the shopkeeper for the weekly big shop. We traded community for convenience. We traded freshness for shelf life. The corner shops that survived boarded up their windows and became convenience stores, lit by harsh fluorescent tubes, selling rented videotapes and frozen pizzas. By 1980, the transformation was complete. Stand in that living room again. The coal fire is gone, replaced by a gas effect flame. The wireless is gone, replaced by a massive hi-fi stack. The heavy drapes are gone, replaced by vertical blinds. The silence of the 1950s is gone, replaced by the constant hum of the fridge, the washing machine, the central heating pump, and the television. We were warmer, we were cleaner, we were richer, we were faster. But as we sat in our warm, owned, double-glazed homes watching our rented movies, we had to ask ourselves, had we left something vital back in the cold and the dark? To look back at these 3 decades is to witness perhaps the fastest, most comprehensive social revolution in British history. A child born in 1950 was born into an empire of coal, steam, and deference. By the time they turned 30, they were living in a world of plastic, silicon, and individualism. We gained so much in that short sprint. We banished the damp and the cold, we washed away the soot, we liberated women from the drudgery of the washboard and the mangle, we replaced the crushing silence of the Victorian Sunday with the choice of a global culture. But in our rush to modernise, we paid a price. We traded the we for the me. We traded the unlocked front door for the burglar alarm. We traded the patience of saving for the instant gratification of credit. The Britain of 1980 was a brighter, faster, louder place. It was a land of opportunity, where you could buy your own home and choose your own destiny. The grey blanket of the post-war years had been lifted, but sometimes, in the quiet moments, amidst the hum of the central heating and the glow of the video recorder, the generation that lived through it all might wonder if we moved a little too fast. We successfully built a much better house, but we may have left the community out in the cold.